Connor or had spent most of his life being judged before he ever spoke a single word. In the kingdom of Ilarion, Omegas were expected to be elegant, slender, beautiful, and delicate enough to make any alpha feel protective. Connor was none of those things. He was noticeably overweight, soft around the middle, broad in the hips, and heavier than any Omega most people had ever seen. Strangers often noticed his size before they noticed his warm smile, his hardworking nature, or the intelligence behind his eyes. Some called him ugly. Others called him hopeless. A few were cruel enough to laugh directly in his face. After years of hearing the same insults, Connor had learned how to smile through them, but that did not mean they stopped hurting. At 26 years old, Connor had no family left, no inheritance, and no future waiting for him in the city. He survived by working jobs nobody else wanted, carrying sacks, hauling water, cleaning kitchens, and doing whatever was necessary to earn enough coin to survive. That was why the notice pinned outside the supply hall immediately caught his attention. Ravenhill Ranch seeking workers. Room and board provided. No references required. Connor stared at those last 3 words longer than anything else. No references required. Most employers wanted recommendations. Most wanted proof that somebody important trusted you. Connor had nobody willing to write such a letter. Whoever owned Ravenhill Ranch was either desperate or practical enough not to care. Either way, it was a chance. 3 days later, he climbed aboard a supply wagon heading north. The driver was an older beta named Angus Reed. He had weathered skin, gray hair, and the steady patience of someone who had spent most of his life on the road. During the journey, Angus kept glancing at Connor as if trying to figure him out. "You know who owns Ravenhill Ranch?" Angus finally asked. "I know the name," Connor replied. Angus snorted. "Then you don't know nearly enough." Connor shifted slightly on the wooden bench. "Tell me." For a while, only the sound of wagon wheels filled the road. Then Angus sighed. Davos Ashbourne. The name was impossible to ignore. Every citizen in Ilarion knew it. Davos Ashbourne had once been Alpha King. Then everything fell apart. His father died unexpectedly. His younger brother, Prince Wade Ashbourne, accused him of treason. The royal court turned against him. The throne was taken. The crown was stripped away. Instead of execution, Davos was exiled. And now he lived at Ravenhill Ranch. A king reduced to a rancher. "Is he cruel?" Connor asked. "No." "Then what's the problem?" Angus looked toward the horizon. "He's a man who lost everything." That answer stayed with Connor for the rest of the trip. Late in the afternoon, Ravenhill Ranch finally appeared. The first thing Connor noticed was not the house. It was the damage. The fences leaned. The fields looked dry. The cattle were thinner than they should have been. A large structure near the pasture had recently burned, and black smoke still lingered above the ruins. The entire ranch looked exhausted, like it had been fighting a losing battle for a very long time. Several ranch hands stood near the burned building. Among them was a tall alpha dressed in simple work clothes. Connor recognized him immediately. Davos Ashbourne. The former king looked nothing like the portraits that once hung throughout Ilarion. The paintings showed confidence. The man standing before him looked harder, older, colder. His dark hair had grown longer than royal standards allowed. His jaw carried several days of stubble. His eyes looked like someone who had stopped expecting good things from life. The wagon rolled to a stop. Connor climbed down. The wooden step creaked loudly beneath his weight. One of the younger ranch hands smirked. Another nudged his friend. "That's the Omega they hired?" The comment was not quiet enough. Connor heard it. So did Davos. The former king looked briefly toward the ranch hand. Nothing was said. Yet the young man immediately shut his mouth. Davos stepped forward. "You answered the notice?" "Yes." His gaze moved over Connor once. Not mockingly. Not dismissively. Simply observing. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you work livestock?" "Yes." "Can you work hard?" Connor almost laughed. "That's mostly what I've done my entire life." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Davos's face. Not amusement. Not approval. Recognition. "Room beside the kitchen," Davos said. "Meals are at noon and sunset. If you stay, you work." "I didn't come here to avoid work." Davos nodded once and walked away. No welcome. No handshake. No further conversation. Just work. Connor watched him go. For some reason he felt sorry for him. Not because Davos had lost a throne, but because he looked lonely. The kitchen turned out to be worse than expected. Dirty dishes covered the counters. Food had spoiled. The stove was cold. Dust seemed to cover everything. Connor placed his bag in the corner and immediately rolled up his sleeves. If this was going to be his home, he would make it livable. Hours passed. He cleaned, cooked, organized. By sunset, the transformation was obvious. Fresh bread cooled on the counter. Beans simmered in a pot. Coffee filled the room with warmth. One by one, the ranch hands entered. Most looked surprised. A few looked impressed. Nobody complained once they started eating. Davos arrived last. He sat down quietly and began eating while reviewing a ledger. Even during supper, he was working. Even during supper, he looked exhausted. Connor noticed something else as well. For an alpha, Davos's pheromones were strangely restrained. Most powerful alphas naturally dominated a room. Davos felt like someone forcing everything inside a locked cage. After the meal ended, darkness settled over Ravenhill Ranch. Connor was washing dishes when shouting suddenly erupted outside. Then came the terrified cries of livestock. He rushed toward the doorway. A lower barn was burning. Flames climbed rapidly through dry timber. Smoke poured into the evening sky. Men grabbed buckets. Others shouted instructions. Nobody moved toward the entrance. Then Connor heard it. Calves. Still trapped inside. Several ranch hands exchanged panicked looks. One cursed. Another shook his head. The heat was already intense. The roof might collapse at any moment. Across the pasture, Davos was running toward the fire. But he was still too far away. Much too far. Connor looked at the flames. Then at the trapped animals. Then back at the flames again. Every sensible thought told him not to move. The last person anyone expected to charge into a burning barn was the overweight Omega who had arrived only hours earlier. Connor grabbed a soaked canvas cloth from a water trough and threw it over his head. One ranch hand stared. "What are you doing?" Connor didn't answer. Because by then he was already sprinting directly toward the fire. And behind him, the entire ranch exploded into shocked shouting. The next morning began before sunrise. Connor woke to the sound of wind rattling the kitchen shutters and the distant lowing of hungry cattle somewhere beyond the dark fields. His muscles ached from the previous day's work and from carrying frightened calves through smoke. Yet the moment he sat up and remembered where he was, he pushed the discomfort aside and climbed out of bed. Pain had never been a good enough excuse to stop moving. The kitchen was still cold when he entered, but that did not last long. He built a fire, filled a kettle, started coffee, and began preparing breakfast while the rest of Ravenhill Ranch remained asleep. By the time the first streaks of sunlight appeared over the horizon, the smell of fresh bread and sizzling salt pork had replaced the lingering scent of smoke drifting from the burned barn. The ranch hands arrived one by one, and unlike the previous evening, they did not look at Connor with the same open amusement. Some still seemed uncertain about him, but uncertainty was already a significant improvement over ridicule. One of the younger hands sat down and immediately grabbed a piece of bread. "Didn't think you'd still be here." Connor raised an eyebrow. "Neither did you?" The young man flushed slightly while the others laughed. "No offense. None taken." Across the room, Davos entered without announcing himself. He sat down, accepted a plate, and started eating. Like the night before, a ledger rested beside him. Like the night before, he appeared more interested in numbers than food. Connor watched him briefly. The former king looked exhausted. Not physically. Something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that settled inside a person after carrying disappointment for too long. As breakfast ended, Davos closed the ledger and stood. "Connor." The Omega looked up. "Yes. Come with me." Several ranch hands immediately exchanged curious looks. Connor wiped his hands and followed. Outside, the morning air felt dry enough to crack. The sun had barely risen, yet the land already looked thirsty. Davos walked toward the northern pasture without speaking, and Connor matched his pace. After several minutes, Davos finally spoke. "You ran into a burning barn yesterday." Connor almost smiled. "So I've been told. You could have died. Those calves would have died." Davos glanced toward him. The alpha's expression remained unreadable. "Most people would have stayed outside. Most people aren't me." Something resembling approval flickered briefly across Davos's face before disappearing. They continued walking. The farther they moved from the ranch house, the more damage Connor noticed. Grass that should have been green had faded into brittle yellow. The ground carried long cracks. Even the cattle seemed weaker than they should have been. Eventually Davos stopped near a fence line. This is where the real problem starts. Connor studied the land. At first glance, everything looked exactly as expected for a drought-stricken ranch. Then he noticed something. A subtle change in soil color. A darker patch. Small enough that most people would ignore it. Connor crouched. He pressed his fingers into the dirt. Cool. Not wet, but cooler than it should have been. His eyes narrowed. Davos watched quietly. You see something? Maybe. Connor stood and slowly scanned the surrounding terrain. The ridge, the slope, the fence line, the drainage path. His father had taught him years ago that land always left clues if someone bothered paying attention. Most people never did. You've looked here before? Connor asked. Many times. And nothing. Connor remained silent. Nothing was not the answer he would have chosen. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous. Wrong. Like a puzzle piece sitting slightly out of place. Unfortunately, he could not explain why. Not yet. The rest of the morning passed in work. Connor returned to the kitchen while Davos handled ranch business. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the northern pasture. Every time he remembered that patch of darker earth, something inside him insisted he was missing an important detail. By noon, lunch was ready. The ranch hands crowded around the table. Conversation flowed more easily than it had the previous day. Several of them even joked with Connor. Only one person remained distant. Davos. The former king listened more than he spoke. Observed more than he participated. At one point, one of the younger hands mentioned the capital. The effect was immediate. A shadow crossed Davos's face. The room fell silent. Nobody brought up the subject again. Later that afternoon, Connor carried supplies into storage while Angus Reed sorted inventory nearby. The older beta watched him work for several minutes. You know, Angus said, people are already talking about you. Connor sighed. That sounds dangerous. Angus laughed. They can't figure you out. What's there to figure out? You saved livestock your first day. That was common sense. You challenged Davos without realizing it. Connor stopped moving. What? Angus leaned against a crate. Most people tiptoe around him. I wasn't aware there were rules. There aren't. Good. The older man chuckled. For the first time since arriving, Connor found himself relaxing slightly. Then Angus became serious. He's not a bad man. I never thought he was. No. Angus looked toward the ranch house. But he's forgotten how to hope. The words lingered. That evening, after supper, Connor stayed behind to finish cleaning. The ranch gradually grew quiet. Darkness settled over Ravenhill. One by one, lamps disappeared. Eventually only the kitchen remained lit. Connor dried the final plate and set it aside. Then he noticed movement outside the window. Davos, standing alone, looking toward the northern pasture. For some reason, he looked exactly the same as he had in the royal portraits and completely different at the same time. Not because of the clothes. Not because of the ranch. Because the loneliness was visible now. Connor hesitated before stepping outside. The Alpha heard him approach. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. After a while, Connor asked, "Do you ever stop working?" "No. You should try." Davos actually looked at him. "Is that advice?" "Absolutely." The corner of Davos's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. Close enough that Connor noticed. Then the former king looked back toward the pasture. "What keeps you going?" Davos asked quietly. The question surprised him. Connor thought for a moment. "Tomorrow." Davos frowned. "Tomorrow? Things can improve tomorrow. What if they don't?" Connor looked across the dry fields. "Then I try again the day after." The wind moved between them. Neither man spoke. Eventually Davos nodded once. Not agreement. Not disagreement. Just acknowledgement. Connor started back toward the house. Halfway there he stopped. That strange feeling returned. The same feeling he had experienced near the northern ridge. He turned. His gaze locked onto the distant pasture visible beneath the moonlight. The darker patch of earth. The unusual slope. The old fence running across the ridge. Suddenly his heartbeat quickened. Not because he had found the answer. Because he was dangerously close to finding one. Something was hidden out there. Something important. Something that might explain why Ravenhill Ranch was dying. Connor stared into the darkness. And for the first time since arriving, he felt certain that the ranch's biggest problem was not drought at all. It was something nobody had noticed. Yet, Connor could not stop thinking about the northern ridge. The strange patch of darker earth remained in his mind through breakfast, through lunch, and through every task that followed. While his hands worked, his thoughts kept returning to the same question. If drought was truly the ranch's biggest problem, why did that section of land look different from everything around it? Why was the soil cooler? Why did the old fence line seem so oddly placed? The more he thought about it, the less comfortable he became. Land did not lie. People lied. Records lied. Nobles lied. But land always left evidence behind. 3 days after his discovery, Connor finally found an excuse to walk the northern pasture again. The afternoon sun hung low overhead, turning the fields into a sea of dusty gold. Most of the ranch hands were occupied repairing fencing damage during the fire, while Davos spent the day buried beneath ledgers and contracts. Connor carried a small sack over one shoulder and headed toward the ridge. Technically, he was supposed to be checking supplies. Technically. In reality, he wanted another look. The walk took nearly an hour. When he finally reached the darker patch of soil, he crouched and pressed his palm against the ground. Cool. Again. His heartbeat quickened. This time he examined everything more carefully. The ridge, the slope, the direction of runoff, the old fence. Then something clicked. Not a complete answer. Just enough to make him realize he was asking the wrong question. The problem wasn't where the water was. The problem was where it wasn't. He stood slowly. A ranch this size should not have been drying out this evenly. Some sections should have survived longer. Some sections should have held moisture. Instead, everything downstream looked starved. As if something had interrupted the natural flow years ago. His eyes landed on the fence. The old fence. The one that ran across the base of the ridge. The one nobody seemed to question. A cold feeling settled into his stomach. What if you're in the way? He murmured. The fence, of course, offered no answer. By the time he returned to the ranch house, the sun had begun sinking toward the horizon. Davos stood outside the main barn speaking with Angus Reed. Both men turned when Connor approached. The former king's eyes narrowed slightly. You've been gone a while. I was walking the northern pasture. Why? Connor hesitated. Not because he doubted himself. Because he hated sounding foolish. I think your water problem may be worse than drought. Angus immediately looked interested. Davos looked skeptical. Explain. Connor took a slow breath. I think something disrupted the natural flow beneath the ridge years ago. Davos folded his arms. What something? The fence. Several seconds passed. Then Angus laughed. Not mockingly. Just surprised. The fence. Connor nodded. The soil is cooler around it. The moisture patterns don't make sense. Everything below that line looks deprived. Davos stared at him. The alpha's face revealed almost nothing. Finally he asked, and you figured this out by walking around? I figured it out by paying attention. The answer hung between them. Angus looked amused. Davos did not. Yet he also did not dismiss him. That alone felt important. We'll look tomorrow, Davos said at last. Then he turned and walked away. Angus watched him leave before glancing toward Connor. You realize most people wouldn't argue with a former king. I wasn't arguing. Good. The older beta chuckled. Because somehow you managed to win anyway. The following morning they rode north together. Davos, Angus, Connor. Several ranch hands accompanied them. The deeper they investigated, the more evidence appeared. Cool soil. Unexpected moisture. Subtle changes in elevation. By afternoon, even Davos could no longer ignore what they were seeing. The fence might actually be interfering with an underground water channel. The discovery should have been encouraging. Instead, it created a new problem. Because fixing it would require labor they could barely afford. And if Connor was wrong, the ranch would lose valuable time. That evening Davos sat alone on the porch reviewing numbers. Connor carried 2 cups of coffee outside and placed one beside him. The alpha looked up. You didn't have to. Neither did you. Davos frowned slightly. Neither did I what? Keep pretending everything is fine. The former king looked away. Silence stretched between them. Then he released a slow breath. If we pull that fence and nothing changes, we're worse off than before. I know. And if we're right? Connor looked toward the distant ridge. Then Ravenhill survives. For a long moment neither spoke. Finally Davos picked up the coffee. You're unusually stubborn. Connor smiled. That's a polite way of saying difficult. The corner of Davos's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Close enough. The next week became the busiest since Connor's arrival. While plans formed around the ridge, another problem appeared. The calf died. At first nobody thought much of it. The drought had already weakened the herd. Losses were expected. Then a second calf died. Then a third. Something about it bothered Connor immediately. The deaths felt wrong. The animals weren't simply starving. The symptoms didn't match. One evening he walked through the eastern pasture after sunset and found another sick calf struggling to stand. The animal trembled violently. His breathing sounded uneven. His eyes looked dull. Connor knelt beside it. His stomach tightened. He had seen something similar years ago, back on his family's farm. Not disease. Poison. The realization hit him hard enough that he immediately stood and headed toward the ranch house. Davos was still awake. He found the Alpha in his office surrounded by ledgers. The former king looked up when Connor entered. What happened? I think someone's poisoning your livestock. The room became very still. Davos set down his pen. Explain. Connor did. Every symptom. Every observation. Every concern. By the time he finished, Davos's expression had become frighteningly cold. Who? I don't know. Why? That answer is easier. Connor met his gaze. Someone wants this ranch to fail. Neither man needed to say the next part aloud. Both already knew the most likely suspect. Prince Wade Ashbourne. The following morning they began investigating. Quietly. Without alerting anyone. Water troughs were checked. Feed supplies examined. Storage rooms inspected. At first nothing appeared unusual. Then Angus found residue near one of the eastern troughs. Not enough to prove anything. Enough to raise questions. Questions became certainty when they discovered footprints near a fence line that should have been empty. Someone had entered the property. Recently. Davos stared at the tracks for a long time. The anger rolling beneath his control felt almost tangible. Connor noticed it immediately. The Alpha's scent remained restrained, but tiny cracks had begun appearing in that control. Not enough to overwhelm anyone. Enough to reveal how furious he truly was. That same week, an invitation arrived from a neighboring noble family. A gathering. A dinner. A chance to rebuild business relationships. Davos hated the idea. The ranch needed support. He went anyway. And he brought Connor. The moment they entered the estate hall, Connor understood exactly how nobles viewed him. Eyes followed him everywhere. Whispers spread. Not subtle whispers. Deliberate ones. Several Omegas covered smiles behind wine glasses. One Alpha openly laughed. I thought they were exaggerating. Another nodded. So did I. Connor had heard worse. Much worse. Still, hearing it never became easier. He focused on breathing. Focused on keeping his expression calm. Focused on not letting them see how much it hurt. Then one noblewoman spoke loudly enough for half the room to hear. An Omega that size should probably stay in the kitchen. Laughter followed. The sound spread across the hall. Connor felt heat rise into his face. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the room. Cold. Controlled. Dangerous. Interesting. The laughter stopped immediately. Every head turned. Davos stood beside him. The former king's expression revealed nothing, which somehow made it worse. Because from where I'm standing, Davos continued calmly, the only people embarrassing themselves tonight are the ones mocking a man who has accomplished more in a month than most of you have accomplished in your entire lives. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody laughed now. Nobody even breathed loudly. Davos's gaze moved across the room. One noble at a time. If any of you spent less energy judging appearances and more energy solving problems, perhaps your estates wouldn't be failing. The humiliation landed like a hammer. Nobody challenged him. Nobody dared. Connor stared at Davos. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Not because he needed rescuing. Not because he was helpless. But because someone had chosen him. Defended him. Publicly. Without hesitation. The rest of the evening passed differently. People still stared. But nobody mocked him again. When they finally returned to Ravenhill Ranch, the night air felt cooler, quieter, safer. The ride home remained silent for several minutes. Then Connor spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Davos kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Yes. Why?" The Alpha considered the question, then answered simply, "Because they were wrong." The response should have been small. Instead it stayed with Connor the entire night. Neither man realized someone else had been watching. Someone hidden near the estate grounds. Someone who immediately carried news back to the capital. Back to Wade Ashbourne. Back to the prince who was becoming increasingly frustrated by every report arriving from Ravenhill Ranch. The ranch was supposed to fail. Davos was supposed to break. Instead, the former king was recovering. And according to the newest reports, a certain Omega seemed to be the reason why. The decision was made before sunrise. If Ravenhill would not collapse on its own, someone would need to help it. And this time, the target would not be the ranch. It would be Connor or... The decision had already been made in the capital, but Ravenhill Ranch did not feel the blade until 3 nights later. Connor noticed the wrongness before anyone shouted. Not because he saw a weapon or heard a footstep, but because the animals changed. The cattle in the lower pen stopped shifting lazily and bunched toward the far fence. The horses lifted their heads all at once, and the old guard dog that usually slept by the kitchen door began growling toward the tree line with his teeth showing. Connor was carrying a basket of folded cloth back from the wash line when that sound reached him, low and steady, and every instinct he had learned from farm life told him danger had crossed onto the land. He did not scream. He did not run blindly. He set the basket down, stepped backward toward the kitchen door, and reached for the iron poker beside the stove because the nearest rifle was in the tack room and too far away. The yard looked normal at first glance, with moonlight lying across the dust and the barn standing dark against the ridge. Yet the silence had become too arranged, too held, as if someone out there was waiting for him to move exactly where they wanted. Then a shadow detached itself from the side of the storage shed, and Connor saw the knife. The man came fast, faster than Connor expected, but not faster than fear could sharpen him. Connor swung the poker with both hands, catching the attacker across the wrist before the blade reached his ribs. The man cursed, staggered, then lunged again, and this time Connor was forced back against the wall hard enough to knock the breath from his chest. He smelled leather, sweat, and something bitter on the man's gloves, a scent that did not belong to ranch work, and that told him enough. This was not a thief. This was not a hungry traveler. This was Wade's next move. Connor slammed his knee upward, twisted away, and shouted Davos's name, not as a helpless cry, but as a warning that the enemy had finally stepped into the open. The attacker grabbed him by the arm before he could reach the door. The knife flashed near his shoulder, and pain burned across his side in a hot, tearing line. The world tilted for a second. He heard the iron poker hit the floor. He heard another horse snort from the darkness. More than one man had come. Then the night broke apart. Davos crossed the yard like a storm given human form. He struck the first attacker so hard the man slammed into the shed wall and dropped without another sound. Angus appeared from the barn with a rifle in his hands, barking orders to the ranch hands who were rushing from the bunkhouse half-dressed and half-awake, while 2 more shadows tried to flee toward the fence. One was caught by the younger hands near the trough. Another vanished into the trees, but not before Angus fired a warning shot close enough to make him stumble and curse into the dark. Davos did not chase them. The moment he saw blood on Connor's shirt, everything else ceased to matter. Connor. The way he said the name made the yard fall silent. Connor tried to stand straighter, because he hated the fear that had suddenly appeared in Davos's face. "I'm all right," he said, though the words came out thinner than he wanted. "It's not deep." Davos reached him in 2 steps and caught him when his knees weakened. The Alpha's hands were steady, but his scent was not. The restraint he had carried like armor since Connor met him began cracking open in waves. Dark cedar, winter smoke, iron, rage, fear, and something fiercely protective that made every ranch hand lower their eyes without being told. Connor felt it wrap around him before Davos even lifted him. Not violent toward him, never toward him, but so intense that the captured attacker began trembling in the dirt. "Who sent you?" Davos demanded. The man spat blood and laughed, but the sound died when Davos turned his head. Angus stepped between them quickly, not because he pitied the attacker, but because he knew exactly what an alpha like Davos could become if fear tipped fully into fury. "Get Connor inside," he said, voice firm enough to cut through the storm. I'll handle this one. For a moment Davos did not move. Then Connor touched his sleeve with shaking fingers. Davos, please. That single word reached him. He carried Connor inside, not gently in the sense of weakness, but carefully, as if every movement had to be measured because the person in his arms mattered too much to risk. In the kitchen, he laid him on the long table while Angus's niece, Mara, a quiet beta woman who helped with mending and medicines, cut away the torn cloth and cleaned the wound. The blade had sliced across Connor's side below the ribs, painful and bloody but not fatal. Connor knew that. Mara said it twice. Angus said it again when he came in from the yard after binding the prisoners. Davos still looked as if the world had nearly ended. He came for me, Connor said after the bandage was tied. Not the cattle. Not the water. Me. Davos stood at the far end of the kitchen with both hands braced against the counter. His head lowered, his shoulders rigid. I know. They failed. This time. Connor watched him closely. Don't do that. Davos looked up. Don't turn this into another reason to blame yourself, Connor said, forcing steadiness into his voice because the pain was trying to pull him under. Wade chose this. Not you. The name Wade changed the room. The wounded attacker had carried a token from one of the prince's old guard companies, and Angus had already found a scrap of payment record hidden inside the man's coat, enough to connect him to a courier route that served Wade's loyal estates. It was not yet enough to bring a prince down, but it was enough to prove the pattern. Wade was not only sabotaging Ravenhill now. He was trying to erase the person helping Davos survive it. Davos crossed the room slowly. You almost died because of me. Connor's face softened despite the pain. No. I almost died because a coward realized I was not as useless as he expected. The answer struck deeper than he intended. Davos stopped beside him, and for a long moment his expression held too many things at once. Anger, fear, guilt, relief, and an ache so raw Connor looked away before it became too much to bear. The kitchen had gone quiet around them. Even Angus, who had entered with a report, paused at the doorway and then silently stepped back out, leaving them alone under the low lamplight. Davos sat beside the table. I heard them laugh at you at that dinner, he said quietly. I heard what they called you before that. Heavy. Unwanted. A mistake of an Omega. I told myself it was only cruelty, and cruelty is common among people who have never had to prove their worth. Connor swallowed. But tonight, Davos continued, his voice lower now, I understood something worse. Wade believed it too. He believed if he removed you, everything you built here would collapse. He saw what others refused to see. Connor tried to answer lightly, because emotion frightened him more than pain. That I'm very good with fences and soup? Davos did not smile. That you are the reason I started standing again. The words settled into Connor's chest with painful warmth. He had spent years being measured by what his body failed to be, by every standard he did not fit, by every alpha who never looked at him twice unless it was to laugh. Yet the man beside him, a fallen king who had lost everything and trusted almost no one, was looking at him now as if his existence had become necessary. Davos, he whispered. You don't owe me beautiful words because I got hurt. I know. Then why say them? Because I should have said them before someone tried to take the chance away. Connor's breath caught. Davos reached for his hand. He did not grab or claim. He offered. And Connor placed his fingers into the alpha's palm because his heart had already moved before fear could stop it. The scent between them changed. Not forced, not overwhelming, but warmer. Like a closed room finally opening to air. Connor felt his own pheromone answer despite exhaustion. Soft honey, baked bread, rain on warm soil, all the things he had tried so hard to keep controlled because an Omega like him was taught that even his scent was something people might mock. Davos leaned closer, slowly enough to give him every chance to refuse. Connor did not refuse. Their first kiss was not polished. It was careful, aching, and full of everything neither had known how to say. Davos kissed him like a man terrified of hurting him and equally terrified of letting go. Connor answered with the quiet courage he had used his whole life. Not delicate, not perfect, but true. When they parted, Davos rested his forehead near Connor's temple and closed his eyes. I want you beside me, he said. Not as someone useful to the ranch. Not as someone I am grateful to. As mine, if you choose it, and as the person I belong to in return. Connor's eyes burned. People will laugh. Let them. They'll say you chose badly. They've been wrong about almost everything else. The laugh that escaped Connor shook with tears. I'm not the kind of Omega kings choose. Davos opened his eyes. Then kings have been choosing poorly. It was not a grand speech. It did not need to be. Connor looked at him, at the alpha who had been stripped of a crown but not of honor, at the man whose hands had carried him from danger, at the man who saw him not despite his size, but beyond the cruelty attached to it, and something inside him finally loosened. He had not realized how tired he was of defending his right to be loved. Yes, he whispered. Davos went completely still. Connor tightened his fingers around his hand. If you're asking me to stay beside you, then yes. The bond between them did not crash into place like thunder. It unfolded slowly, deeply, with Davos pressing a reverent kiss to the side of Connor's neck where an alpha's mark would one day rest, and Connor leaning into him instead of pulling away. It was not a careless claim, not instinct without consent, not hunger pretending to be love. It was a promise formed under lamplight while blood still stained the bandage at Connor's side and danger waited beyond the walls. Davos did not mark him fully that night, not while Connor was wounded and weak from blood loss, but he made the vow where a mark would belong, and Connor answered by touching the same place beneath Davos's collar, a silent bond recognized before it became visible to the world. By dawn, the captured attacker had spoken. Not out of courage. Out of fear. He named the courier who paid him. He named the estate that sheltered the hired men. He named the symbol used on sealed instructions. When Angus laid the information across the kitchen table, Davos read it with a calm that frightened everyone more than rage would have. This is enough to find more, Angus said. Davos looked at Connor, who sat wrapped in a blanket near the stove, pale but awake. Their eyes met, and something steady passed between them. The night had changed them. Wade had meant to remove a weakness, but instead he had created the one thing he should have feared most. Unity. Davos folded the paper carefully. Then we start today. Outside, the sun rose over Ravenhill Ranch, touching the old fence line, the recovering pasture, the barns, the yard where blood had been washed into the dirt, and the house where a fallen king and an unwanted Omega had chosen each other while enemies gathered in the distance. By evening, Angus would ride to contact Roland Mercer. By week's end, the trail would lead to ledgers, witnesses, and Wade's own handwriting. And somewhere in the capital, Prince Wade Ashbourne would soon learn that Connor had survived. Worse than survived. He had become the one person Davos would burn kingdoms to protect. Morning arrived at Ravenhill Ranch carrying a sense of momentum none of them had felt in years. The attack against Connor had changed something fundamental. Before that night, Davos and the people around him had been reacting to Wade's schemes. After that night, they finally began pushing back. The information recovered from the captured attacker became the first stone in an avalanche. Angus rode out twice within the same week, meeting old contacts who had once worked for noble families loyal to the Ashbourne crown. Roland Mercer returned with additional records. A merchant who had quietly supplied several of Wade's operations suddenly found himself facing questions he could no longer avoid. Another former employee came forward after hearing rumors that the Crown's investigators might soon become involved. One witness led to another. One record led to another. One lie exposed the next. By the end of the month, the stack of evidence on Davos's desk had become impossible to ignore. The former king spent long nights reviewing every document personally. Connor often remained beside him, helping organize names, dates, payments, and correspondence. Sometimes neither spoke for hours. The silence no longer felt awkward, felt natural. One evening, while reviewing another ledger, Connor noticed Davos rubbing his eyes. You need sleep. Davos continued reading. I need proof. You already have proof. I need enough proof that nobody can protect him. Connor watched him for a moment before quietly removing the ledger from his hands. Davos immediately frowned. Connor, sleep. The king's expression suggested he was preparing an argument. Instead, he sighed. The sound made Connor smile. You know, the Omega said, for someone who once ruled a kingdom, you're surprisingly bad at accepting help. And you're surprisingly comfortable giving orders to a king. Maybe because I met you after you became tolerable. To Connor's satisfaction, Davos actually laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but genuinely. The sound remained one of Connor's favorite things in the world. The trial began less than 2 months later. The capital transformed overnight. Nobles arrived from every corner of Valerian. Merchants delayed business to follow developments. Citizens crowded public squares hoping for updates. The kingdom had spent years living beneath uncertainty. Now everyone wanted answers. Davos returned to the capital not as an exile but as a claimant. Connor stood beside him throughout everything. The first day of proceedings lasted nearly 10 hours. The second lasted even longer. Wade entered the courtroom carrying the confidence of a man who believed power would protect him. By the end of the first week, that confidence had begun to crack. Witnesses testified. Financial records appeared. Former allies abandoned him. Several individuals directly connected Wade to the sabotage of Ravenhill Ranch. Others connected him to attacks against neighboring estates loyal to Davos. Then came the letters. The courtroom fell silent as copies of Wade's own correspondence were read aloud. Specific instructions. Specific payments. Specific targets. Every page pushed another nail into the coffin. Wade stopped smiling. The kingdom stopped doubting. And Davos stopped looking like a defeated man. On the final day, judgment arrived. The verdict echoed through the chamber like a bell. Prince Wade Ashbourne was stripped of rank. Stripped of title. Stripped of succession rights. All property and political authority were revoked. Most importantly, the accusations against Davos were officially overturned. Every charge, every lie, every stain placed upon his name, gone. For several seconds after the verdict, nobody moved. Then the room erupted. Some people cheered. Others cried. Several nobles immediately began pretending they had supported Davos all along. Connor ignored all of them. His attention remained fixed on the alpha standing beside him. Davos did not celebrate, did not raise his voice, did not smile, but his shoulders straightened. And somehow that meant more than any speech. The kingdom welcomed its king home 3 months later. The coronation became one of the largest public celebrations in decades. Gold banners covered the capital. Musicians filled the streets. Church bells rang from sunrise until sunset. Yet the moment people remembered most happened after the crown touched Davos's head. Standing before the court, the newly restored king announced the person who would stand beside him. Not a noble Omega. Not the child of an influential house. Not someone chosen for politics. He chose Connor, or the overweight Omega from Ravenhill Ranch. The room reacted exactly as expected. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Then Davos calmly informed everyone that their opinions on the matter were irrelevant. The announcement ended the discussion. Connor became Omega consort of Valerian. The transition from ranch life to palace life felt surreal. Connor never completely adjusted to servants following him everywhere. He never became comfortable with formal dinners. He never stopped preferring simple meals over expensive banquets. What did surprise him was how easily Davos adapted back into his role. The king worked tirelessly. Council meetings, trade negotiations, military appointments, endless responsibilities. Yet no matter how busy he became, he always made time for Connor. Sometimes it was breakfast together before dawn. Sometimes it was a walk through the palace gardens after dark. Sometimes it was simply sitting together in silence after exhausting days. Months passed. The kingdom stabilized. Ravenhill Ranch flourished under Angus's supervision. Life became something neither of them had dared imagine during those difficult days at the ranch. Then came the morning that changed everything again. Connor had been feeling strangely tired for nearly 2 weeks. Food tasted different. His sleep felt inconsistent. Even the palace physicians noticed. One examination became another, then another. Eventually the oldest physician requested a private conversation. By the time Davos arrived, Connor was smiling. The king immediately became suspicious. What happened? Connor folded his arms. Take a guess. Davos looked from Connor to the physician. Then back again. Several seconds passed. Understanding arrived. The king froze. The physician laughed. Connor laughed. Everyone laughed except Davos, who looked completely overwhelmed. You're certain? He finally asked. The physician nodded. Absolutely certain, Your Majesty. The king sat down, then stood again, then sat back down. Connor spent the next week making fun of him. News spread quickly. The kingdom celebrated. The future heir of Valerian was on the way. Citizens sent gifts. Nobles sent gifts. Foreign rulers sent gifts. The palace slowly filled with tiny blankets, toys, clothing, and enough furniture to fill an entire nursery wing. Davos became unbearable. At least according to Connor. Every physician's recommendation became law. Every unusual symptom became an emergency. Every slight discomfort triggered concern. One evening Connor caught Davos reading a book titled Understanding Omega Pregnancies. The sight nearly killed him with laughter. "You've read 3 books this week. I'm being responsible. You've highlighted sections. They're important. You've added notes. They're useful." Connor laughed so hard he had to sit down. The happiest moments came at night. After the meetings ended. After the servants left. After the kingdom finally became quiet. Davos would sit beside him and rest a hand against his stomach. Sometimes they discussed names. Sometimes they imagined the future. Sometimes they simply listened. One evening the baby kicked. The movement startled both of them. Then it happened again. Davos stared at Connor's stomach as if witnessing a miracle. Connor never forgot the expression on his face. Pure wonder. Months passed. The due date approached. The nursery was completed. The future looked bright. Safe. Certain. Which was exactly why neither man saw danger coming. The storm arrived during the middle of the night. Rain hammered the palace windows. Thunder shook the sky. Lightning illuminated the city beyond the glass. Connor woke with a sharp pain that immediately stole his breath. Within minutes the palace erupted into organized chaos. Servants ran through corridors. Physicians were summoned. Guards secured entire wings. Davos never left Connor's side. Hours passed. Then more hours. The labor became increasingly difficult. Every cry from Connor felt like a blade driven through the king's chest. He held Connor's hand, spoke softly, promised everything would be all right, even when fear whispered otherwise. Near dawn, a baby's cry finally broke through the storm. Relief crashed through the room. Several physicians smiled. Servants relaxed. Davos closed his eyes. The child was here. Their child was here. Then the room became silent. The crying stopped. One physician frowned. Another looked confused. A third exchanged a glance with the others. The atmosphere changed instantly. Davos noticed. So did Connor. "What is it?" Davos asked. Nobody answered. The silence grew heavier. "What is it?" Still nobody answered. The head physician slowly approached the child. His hands visibly trembled. Connor pushed himself upright despite exhaustion. "Let me see." The physicians hesitated. That hesitation alone sent cold fear through the room. Davos stepped forward. The child was carefully lifted. For several long seconds, neither father spoke. Then Connor saw, and the world stopped. The Omega stared, blinking once, then again, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. "No." The word escaped before he could stop it. Davos looked at the child. His face drained of color. Shock, confusion, disbelief. None of it seemed strong enough. The physicians exchanged frightened looks. One crossed himself. Another stepped backward. No one appeared willing to explain what they were seeing. Connor's breathing became uneven. Davos reached for him automatically. The child remained silent. The room remained silent. Outside, thunder rolled across the capital. Far away from the palace, a prison wagon traveled through the rain toward the northern frontier. Inside sat Wade Ashbourne. Broken, defeated, stripped of everything. A guard handed him fresh news from the capital. The former prince listened quietly, then smiled. Slowly, cruelly, the expression spread across his face like poison. "I told him," Wade murmured. The guard frowned. "Told who?" "My brother." The smile widened. "He won his throne back." Wade leaned against the wagon wall and laughed softly. But some victories arrive carrying a price. The rain intensified. Lightning flashed. And somewhere inside the royal palace, 2 fathers stared at their newborn child, while dread settled over the room like a shadow. Wade closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness. "You'll never have the heir you dreamed of, brother." Then he laughed again. And the sound followed the wagon into the storm. And that brings this chapter of Davos and Connor's journey to a close. What started with an exiled Alpha King and an Omega the world refused to value became a story about loyalty, resilience, healing, and love. Together, they rebuilt a dying ranch, uncovered a conspiracy, defeated a prince determined to destroy them, and found a future neither of them ever thought they deserved. But just when happiness finally seemed within reach, everything changed. Why did the room fall silent when their child was born? What did Connor see that left him unable to believe his own eyes? Why did even the physicians look terrified? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why was Wade smiling even after losing everything? The story is far from over. The next part of Davos and Connor's journey is already available on Patreon. You can find the Patreon link in the description below, or simply scan the QR code on screen to access it. As a Patreon member, you'll receive early access to upcoming story releases, exclusive bonus episodes, and extended continuations. Patreon-only ABO, boy love, mafia, fantasy, and romance stories. Longer versions and special content not available on YouTube. Ad-free listening experience. The chance to directly support the channel and help future stories come to life. Every view, every comment, every share, and every bit of support means more than you know. Thank you for spending your time with the story and for being part of this growing community. I truly appreciate each and every one of you, and I hope I'll have the opportunity to welcome you as a Patreon member very soon. Until next time, take care, and may your favorite stories always find their way back to you.